Imagine being a 16-year-old boy whose father has just died and left him the keys, not just to the car, not just to the house, but to multiple mansions, an enormous bank account, and religious leadership of the Western world. This is the ludicrous situation that the young son of Alberic finds himself in at the beginning of this episode. And what do you think he's going to do with it? What do you think most 16-year-old boys would do? If you thought that the answer would be a lot of parties, a lot of drinking, and a lot of sex, you're exactly right. So how did we get here? In the last episode, in the first few decades of the 900s, we saw a powerful woman named Marozia thrown into prison. Now, she had been the leader of the House of Theophylact, a powerful family that controlled not just the office of Pope, but the entire governance of the city of Rome. Marozia had put together a marriage that could have made her more powerful than anyone in her family had ever been. The only problem was that a few days after she got married, her teenage son led a rebellion in Rome that stormed the castle where she was, sent her new husband running away from the city, and allowed her son Alberic to throw her into prison. And we don't hear about her ever again. Her son Alberic, only a teenager himself, proved very astute, because what he did was to separate the religious leadership of the office of Pope from the land-owning bank accounts and the political power of the office of Prince of Rome. Because up until that moment, the office of Pope and Prince of Rome had been in the same person. So Alberic separates these two things, and he takes on himself the role of Prince of Rome, in which he's a governor, a landowner, someone who makes laws and maintains order, and he allowed his older brother to remain the Pope. So by separating these two offices, things calmed down a lot in the city. There was no longer a reason for wealthy Italian families to be tearing each other to pieces, trying to put one of their own members into the Pope's seat. Unfortunately, this condition wasn't going to last very long. Alberic only lived until his early 40s, when he contracted a terrible fever, which was going to kill him. He must have known something was coming, because in his last days, he gathered his counselors together and made them promise to undo the thing that he had done so successfully. He made them promise to create his own son, both Pope and Prince of Rome, thus recombining the two offices again, the very same recipe that had created so much chaos in his mother Marozia's time. So Alberic's 16-year-old son inherits this office, the money, the power from his father. And when he takes on the role of Pope, he calls himself John the 12th. And this was a custom that had already been established of popes taking on new names to go with their office. So his regular street name was no longer the one he used. He became John the 12th. So what happened next? Well, he found himself a very important guy with a lot of new friends, a lot of people who were anxious to curry favor with him. And by all accounts, what happened were 3 years of partying in the palaces and the mansions that belonged to the Pope. There was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of sex. And it wasn't just people who showed up and wanted to have a good time with John the 12th. Apparently their shenanigans extended to people who visited Rome. So one of the main sources of income for the city of Rome at that time was pilgrims. These were devout Christians who wanted to come to the city to visit the churches, to look at some of the shrines, and to possibly see relics, fragments that were preserved from the lives of Jesus or the disciples and were preserved in Rome. So pilgrims would come and they would make donations, they would lay them on the altars of churches, they would deposit them in various places. So you would think that someone who would be intelligent wouldn't want to mess with that revenue stream. But John the 12th was a teenager, and thinking about revenue streams wasn't really his main concern. So things that were reported to happen at this time included things like the Pope and some of his friends sexually assaulting female pilgrims who came into the churches to pray. Think about that for a second. A young woman comes into the church to pray, and she's assaulted by none other than the Holy Father or one of his friends. It's a shocking, scandalous picture. There are other accounts of pilgrims laying down financial donations on the altar, and then the Pope or one of his friends just kind of walking by and casually scooping that up and throwing it into his pocket in plain view. So as you can imagine, this would have a very negative effect. The PR that would be generated by this kind of activity would definitely create a really unfortunate reputation for what was going on in Rome. But we're just getting started. John the 12th, the teenage pope, had many mistresses, lots of women wanting to get into bed with him, and sexual infidelity or unwise decisions weren't exactly new to the Roman public. That itself wouldn't have been enough to make him the scandalous figure that he is. But what people took exception to was him giving gifts to his mistresses, gifts of papal land or sometimes golden ornaments from churches themselves. So these were objects of high monetary value, but they were also objects with religious significance. So for a young man who's pope to be giving these kinds of things as baubles to women that he was bedding, this was taken to be above and beyond the levels of moral depravity that even Romans had become accustomed to under the watch of Marozia and others before. So inside Rome at this point, we have chaos. The teenage pope is groping and possibly raping female pilgrims. He's giving away golden ornaments from inside churches. He's giving away chunks of land so that some of his mistresses actually become very wealthy landowners in their own right as a result. And outside of the city of Rome, the situation isn't any better. So Italy, for several centuries at this point, has lacked any kind of long-term effective centralized rule. It's a territory that's contested by multiple warring factions, one of whom are the Lombards. So the Lombards originally came probably from Scandinavia, and they travel down through Europe and eventually migrate into Italy because they remember it as a green and fertile place. They've heard rumors. Some of them have maybe fought in the Roman army previously. So the Lombards migrate en masse into Italy, and for a brief period of time, there's actually a period where there's a Lombard king who rules much of Italy. But how he does it is he has little dukedoms set up, and each of them has a Lombard duke, and they all sort of report to him. It didn't last for very long, because there were other groups that were interested in controlling Italy, and one of those was the Franks. The Franks come from the area that we now think of as Germany. But the Lombard king and his centralized rule of Italy ended in 774 because he was defeated by a Frankish king named Charlemagne, whom we've mentioned in a previous episode. So who are the Franks? Depends which history you listen to. Some people say they were the Proto-French and others the Proto-Germans, but the Frankish tribes came down from those parts of Europe that we now know as France and Germany. So they're coming into Italy, and for a time, there's a strong Frankish government that controls most of the territory that we now know as Italy. But that also didn't last, because Charlemagne divided his kingdom among his sons, and each of those sons divided their parcel of land amongst their descendants, and very soon there was a fragmented patchwork of much smaller duchies, dukedoms, fiefdoms that were controlled by Frankish nobles. So even though the Lombard central kingdom had been toppled by the Franks, the Frankish administration itself became fragmented. And so there were little pockets of land, some of which were controlled by Frankish nobles, and some of which were still old Lombard dukedoms with the occasional Lombard strongman in charge of smaller areas of land. So at this point in time, as Rome is so chaotic, one of these Lombard dukes, a tough guy named Berengar, decides it would be a perfect time to expand his range of control and lead his own army in a march on Rome, intent on breaking in, pillaging, looting, and taking whatever of value he can find there. So John the 12th is maybe 19 at this point. Most of his attention has been focused on booty and more booty, not really thinking about geopolitics, not really thinking about the downstream effects of his actions on Rome's revenues. Anyway, he gets word that Berengar is coming with a bunch of armed men, and so the party is over for John the 12th. He panics. What is he going to do to protect himself from this imminent disaster? So who does he call? Well, following a well-established tradition of panicking popes in Rome, he decides to call up a Frankish strongman, because the Franks have previously been very successful in kicking the Lombards around and out of Italy. So John the 12th decides to call upon a guy called Otto of Saxony. Otto of Saxony, from the records that we have of him in history, comes across as a very calm, steely, deliberate sort of guy. He doesn't rush into things. He's not hot-headed. He's not impulsive. He'll assess the situation. But when Otto makes a move, he has a tendency to crush whatever is in his way. And in 955, the same year that our teenage dilettante John the 12th becomes pope, Otto has done something absolutely astounding. You see, the Huns have been terrorizing most of Europe, and many European cities live in fear of these Hunnish armies descending on them like a plague of locusts and just decimating everything that they find. So Otto's first step is to unify all the different petty fiefdoms and dukedoms of what is now Germany into one unified state under his leadership. And then he turns his attention to the scourge of Europe, the Huns. Now, there have been many excellent podcasts and histories written about the Huns, and I strongly suggest that you look into them because there are so many details that are just terrifying and strange. It's hard to communicate how absolutely terrified people were of them. It was the sort of thing that mothers would whisper to their children at night. Shh, be quiet, go to sleep, or the Huns will come and get you. They were the bogeymen of Europe, and people were horrified at any rumor that they might be drawing near. So the Hunnish forces had been advancing on what is now Germany for years. They'd been encroaching, fighting battles, but drawing ever nearer. And in 955, they gather in a horde so massive that they boast that their horses can drink the rivers dry and pound the cities to dust with their hooves. Otto brings his army of Franks to meet this terrifying horde. And he doesn't just win a battle. He delivers a defeat so massive that the Hunnish casualties are reported to be in the tens of thousands. He doesn't just win the battle, he wins the war. Because at that point, the wave of Hunnish armies turns around and begins to retreat backwards toward the east. So Otto has won a massive victory, not just for himself, not just for the Franks, but for all of Europe. Now, after this victory, Otto was recognized as a natural leader of sorts by most of Western Europe. But what he wanted now was a title to match, because formally, he was still just the king of the Franks. So the deal that Pope John the 12th was going to make to Otto was one that offered him something that he most craved. It was legitimacy. So the deal that the Pope was offering to Otto was this: come into Italy and get rid of this Berengar. Nullify the threat so that we don't have to worry about him menacing the Papal States or coming in to loot Rome. So if you take back from Berengar the land that he's already stolen and eliminate his ability to take anything else from us, give us back what he's already taken, then in exchange, the Pope is going to crown Otto Emperor of the West. Now, this idea of a Pope making an emperor in the West is kind of outrageous, but it has a precedent. You see, 150 years ago, another Pope, Stephen, had crossed the Alps in the middle of winter to bring another Frankish king into Rome to protect the city from the Lombards. And that Frankish king had been Charlemagne. In exchange for protecting Rome and the Pope, Pope Stephen had crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the West. Now, this position of emperor didn't last very long, because after Charlemagne died, he divided his empire and became smaller and smaller and smaller. So it had evaporated like a sandcastle upon Charlemagne's death. But now, here was Otto being offered this prestigious title once again. And it wasn't just for Otto. It was the prospect of a revived Western Empire, once again united in the hands of a strong Frankish king, who could be another emperor. Otto takes up the challenge. In 961, he leads armies into Italy, expels Berengar from the city of Rome, and camps his army outside that city. Otto himself, with a small bodyguard, will enter the city of Rome to meet Pope John XII at St. Peter's Basilica and receive the crown of Emperor of the West. This coronation moment created an entity known as the Holy Roman Empire, which was going to unite what is now known as Italy and Germany for almost 900 years. Sadly, the goodwill between Otto of Saxony and John XII lasted barely more than 9 days. Otto, newly crowned as Holy Roman Emperor, leaves the city of Rome, followed by his armies, to pursue Berengar and the Lombards in other parts of Italy and make sure that they truly can't come back. John XII, on the other hand, still in his late teens, isn't very good at politics and doesn't really understand the long-term implications of what's going on here. He makes a bizarre decision. And that decision is going to be to try and stab Otto in the back. This is going to take some explanation. Why would this Pope, who's just been saved from imminent destruction at the hands of the Lombards by Otto of Saxony, who's a very powerful warrior and statesman, now decide that it would be a good idea to make an enemy of this man? It's hard to fathom. But so are the ways of teenage boys. Sources suggest that Otto gave John some wise pieces of advice. Clean up your act, young man. Wear your office with the dignity that it requires. Stop having wild orgies. Stop getting drunk. Stop assaulting female pilgrims. Grow up. And John really wasn't used to having anybody tell him what to do, because for several years since his father's death, he'd been the boss. He couldn't be wrong. He could do no wrong. So having this older, more serious, more sober Otto tell him what to do didn't sit well. So anyway, he decides that now would be a good time to get rid of Otto. No sooner has Otto left Rome than John begins to send messages to absolutely everybody he can think of. And he decides, well, if this trick of offering the crown of emperor worked once, why not use it again? So he actually writes to Berengar, the same guy who was about to invade Rome when John got Otto to get rid of him. That same Berengar who's now fighting Otto, John is writing him a letter saying, hey, if you get rid of Otto, if you win, then I'll make you Emperor of the West. But he doesn't just stop with Berengar. He writes letters to anyone else he can think of, including the Eastern Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire. He writes to Muslim forces in the south. He even writes to the Huns. So clearly, John isn't thinking at all about the horrible things that are going to happen to people in Italy if some of these requests of his get answered. Can you imagine what would have happened if the Huns had come riding into Italy? Clearly, John didn't spend much time thinking about it. All he was interested in was being able to run Rome as he saw fit, and anyone that he could make a partner to allow him to do that was fair game. Rome becomes even more chaotic than it has already been. The people of Rome have recently witnessed Otto become Emperor of the West, Holy Roman Emperor, and now John actually invites Berengar's son into the city and promises to crown him as emperor. Meanwhile, various factions and families in Rome are scrambling for alliances. Who should they support? People who are in favor of Otto, of Berengar, of John? Who knows? And Pope John XII's minions are busy dishing out violence and fear to anyone in the city who might happen to support the wrong side. The people of Rome themselves have never been fans of foreign warriors, foreign rulers coming into the city. We saw that in the last episode when they threw out Marozia's foreign husband. And yet even they are so disgusted by John XII's behavior that many of them actually support bringing Otto of Saxony back into the city to clean it up. John is too busy having sex and lots of alcohol to think about anything else. The wild parties in the papal palaces are continuing at this point. Now, Otto of Saxony has only very recently left Rome, and he and his army are out in the field fighting Berengar, and news begins to come to him of what's going on in Rome. And the fact that John XII is busy trying to have Otto removed and bring some new force into Rome. You can guess what Otto thought of this. In fact, he found it hard to believe. It seemed so absolutely, totally insane that he was at first dubious and thought that these were perhaps rumors spread by people who didn't like John. He actually comes across one of these letters that John has written looking for an ally to get rid of Otto himself. So Otto's men intercept one of these letters. They see John's signature on it. He's been caught red-handed. The proof is right there. So Otto sends an envoy to Rome. He sends some messengers to Rome to speak to John personally. He's busy on the battlefield himself, taking care of business, but he sends some guys into Rome to talk to John and say, hey, what's going on? And the insolence that John has with Otto's messengers beggars the imagination. So here come Otto's messengers into Rome saying, hey, what's going on? We've got a letter from Otto here. He knows what you're up to. What are you doing? And John decides to turn it around on Otto and basically say, well, Otto has broken his part of the bargain because he hasn't yet returned all the land that Berengar took from us. So Otto has gone back on his word. That's actually the problem here. Everyone in Italy knew that those lands were the ones that Otto was currently fighting to get control of. He was out there fighting Berengar at that very minute. So Otto's messengers logically respond. They must have scratched their heads at this exchange. He can't return the lands yet because he doesn't have them in his control. What are you talking about? But of course, it was just a classic example of shifting blame and trying to avoid responsibility for the treachery that he had perpetrated. So Otto's messengers go and return to him in the field and explain what's going on, and Pope John goes back to partying. But at some point, Otto finishes with Berengar, and Otto, the hammer of the Huns, and his army turn around and begin to head back to Rome. But at this point, John XII panics because the chickens are going to come home to roost. So he grabs everything that he can lay his hands on that's portable and valuable, and he flees the city. He runs away to another Italian city called Tivoli. So Otto arrives in Rome, the Pope is gone, and Otto is trying to figure out what happened here and how to set things right. So he very logically and methodically calls together a church synod or a council of bishops, and he asks them what happened here. And he's looking for evidence. He wants an account that is not rumor. He wants accounts that can be substantiated. He wants eyewitness evidence. He wants everything to be very much above the board. He's not interested in just assassinating John and getting rid of him. He's a man who's about due process. So he calls these bishops together, and several of them do come forward and say, yes, we've seen with our own eyes John violating absolutely every moral rule that there is, everything that's expected of a pope. Yes, he's had drunken orgies. Yes, he's taken wealth out of the church and given it to his mistresses. Yes, he's profaned the teachings of the church. We've seen him do all of these things. So then Otto sends more messengers to John, who's, off hiding in Tivoli, and he says, you need to return to Rome to answer the charges against you. And don't worry, I'm not here to cut your throat. Nothing is going to happen to you, I give you my word, that doesn't have to do with due process. So you're going to be transported safely, you're going to have a fair trial, but you need to answer these terrible charges that have been made against you. Pope John ignores Otto's messengers. He does send a very cheeky response, a letter to the bishops of Rome, and says, "Oh, I hear you want to replace me. By the way, if any of you attempt this, I will excommunicate you. I will kick you out of the church," basically. And then he goes back to partying and hunting and riding his horse. Back in Rome, because Pope John XII is not coming to stand before the council, Otto instructs the bishops to elect a new pope and to depose John so that he will no longer have the office. There'll be a new pope instead. Hopefully someone who's going to behave a little bit better. The problem is, though, that the pope so far has been elected by Italians. And so when Otto does this new pope is seen to have been placed there by a foreigner. And Romans weren't terribly thrilled about that idea. As soon as Otto left the city of Rome, the vengeful young Pope John XII decides now would be a good time to return to the city. And his purpose here is to punish the bishops and anyone who's had the nerve to speak out against him while he's been gone. So Pope John XII organizes his own church synod in 964, and it's attended by something like 30% of the number of churchmen who showed up for the church council that Otto called. So Pope John XII decrees some ghastly punishments for some of the bishops who've been brave enough to speak out against him when Otto was in the city. One of these bishops has his tongue torn out, another has his hand hacked off, and a third is flogged. So now that he's reasserted his rule through absolute terror, having secured his grip through terrorizing any churchman remaining in Rome, John XII then deposes the new pope that Otto had supported, and that man flees Rome for his life. Otto was in the middle of a military campaign. He was leading armies in the field. He was fighting battles. So when word arrived to him of the new chaos that had broken out in Rome and John doing these insane things, he couldn't immediately turn around and solve the problem. But when the pressure abated, when he had the space, he and his armies did turn around to return to the Eternal City and restore law and order once again. What would have happened if Otto had arrived in Rome and encountered John? We will never actually know, because it didn't happen. It never happened because Pope John XII met his end before Otto could arrive. It turns out that Pope John XII was busy having sex with yet another man's wife, and that angry husband walked in on him while he was in the act and cudgeled the young pope to death. So this was the ignominious end to the career of Pope John XII. So you might think at this point that the rule of the House of Theophylact, this powerful Italian family that produced John XII, is finally over, but you'd be wrong. It's shaped the papacy and Rome itself for more than a century, beginning with Theodora, becoming ever more powerful with Marozia, her daughter, who was finally thrown into prison. Then Marozia's son Alberic reforms Rome and separates the office of Pope from the office of Prince for a little while. But now under John XII, these two things have been combined again. And indeed, this office of Pope, along with all the political power and material wealth that have become attached to it, remains very closely within the grip of this family, the House of Theophylact, for another 3 generations. And their profound ambition and interest only in their own wealth is going to continue to tarnish the office for many years to come. The shameless interest in wealth and power of this family tarnished the office of Pope for generations, and perhaps made the shattering of the Christian world inevitable. So John XII is dead, but the power and influence of his family aren't going anywhere. They remain very wealthy, they have a lot of armed factions that they can control, and it's not long before another member of their family is sitting on the chair of Pope. In the fall of 1032, the grandson of another Theophylact family member becomes pope. His name, the one he takes when he becomes pope, is Benedict IX. By all accounts, he's scandalously young. The question is, how young? Some accounts say he was 14 at the time he became pope. Some say 12. One or two suggest 20, but very, very young. So he's really just a pawn in his family's hand. Someone that they can put into that office so that they can control the money and the influence that attach to it. Now, if you think that just because Benedict IX was really young, he was going to be innocent or well-behaved, I must remind you, he is a Theophylact. So he was described by one bishop at the time as, quote, a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. He's ranked as possibly one of the worst popes ever to inhabit the office, and that includes comparing him to John XII, who we've just spent some considerable time discussing. Benedict IX was too corrupt and violent even for the Roman public, which had a fair bit of experience with morally questionable leadership. Some accounts say that Benedict IX hosted violent orgies inside the Lateran Palace itself. The Lateran Palace was the main residence of the Pope, so it's very much an official building that this sort of thing is going on in. Suffice to say, there were several attempts on Benedict IX's life before the age of 20, and he was compelled to flee Rome multiple times because the citizens of Rome rose up in rebellion against his leadership. But every time, like a bad apple, he came back at the head of his family's private army and reinstalled himself by force. Now, Benedict IX eventually decides, for some reason, that he wants to marry a young woman who may have been his cousin, some accounts suggest. But the young woman's father insisted that he wouldn't let Benedict IX marry his daughter unless Benedict resigned the office of pope. Now, Benedict was willing to do this, but he needed money to get married, and the relentless spending and looting of the papacy during the last century of popes had left actually not a lot for him to take. So he was in the bizarre position of needing to raise money so that he could get married, and he hit upon a scandalous way to do it. He decided to sell the office of pope and take that money to go and get married. Who was he going to sell it to? Well, remember, this is Italy, so he sold it to his godfather. The price was 1,500 pounds of gold. So in May of 945, Giovanni Gratiano, the godfather, became Pope Gregory VI. Now, this was, of course, highly irregular. Popes were not supposed to be appointed by other popes. They weren't supposed to inherit the office like a crown from father to son. And Romans weren't really fans of having foreign rulers come in and create popes either. Popes were supposed to be elected by other churchmen, mainly Italians. So this transfer of the office for a fee was scandalous to anyone who knew about it. Within 12 months, there were now 3 competing candidates for the title of pope. There was the old pope, young Benedict. There was the new pope, the godfather, Gregory. And there was another guy who just decided that he might as well throw his name in as well, since everything was going to be a complete mess. This bizarre situation actually obliged another Frankish ruler, Emperor of the West, Henry III, to come into Rome in 1048 to clean up this disgusting mess. And what he did was basically to say that Benedict IX was no longer going to be pope, but he also didn't have the authority to sell the office to his godfather, so that guy wasn't going to be pope either, and this third candidate was going to be dismissed. Instead, a new candidate would become pope. And this pope was going to be legitimately elected the way they normally were. Now, this century-long soap opera of the House of Theophylact is not just salacious detail. I mean, it does sound a lot like Game of Thrones in the Vatican, doesn't it? But it sets the stage for understanding what's about to happen next. The scandal that has been the office of Pope for so many years helps you understand what bishops and archbishops in other places like Egypt and France and Turkey and Greece might have thought of this idea of the Bishop of Rome and his moral authority. We've just seen the sale of the papacy. We've seen popes deposed. We've seen drunkenness, orgies, and theft. We've seen assaults on female pilgrims. Anything but religious leadership and a devout mission. And yet only 4 years later, the new pope is going to make the claim that he, as pope, has the authority to decide what Christianity looks like for the entire Christian world. Under the circumstances, you might understand why other churchmen in the East thought it was all a bit much. In the next episode, we're going to watch what happens as the Pope makes this claim and the Christian world shatters. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and pick one friend who's a history nerd or likes good stories and let them know about it. And don't forget to come back for episode 4 to watch it all unravel.